Hi, welcome everybody to the discussion this evening with Benjamin Bratton, The Stack, Design in Geopolitics in the Age of Planetary-Scale Computing. We're also live webcasting tonight. My name is Am Johal. I'm the Director of Community Engagement here. I just want to begin by acknowledging that we're on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. I also want to just take the time to acknowledge the other departments that have supported this talk being able to happen, people that we collaborate with regularly from the Institute for Humanities, which we work with 12 or 15 times a year. I want to particularly thank Sabir Gandesha and the team there, the SFU English Department, Jeff Dirksen, and others there. Also want to mention this coming Wednesday, Rawi Hodge, the writer-in-residence, will be presenting a talk in the World Arts Center in the building on Wednesday evening at 7. As well, SFU Galleries, Melanie O'Brien and Amy Kazimirchuk are here. And, of course, the School for Contemporary Arts, which houses the academic program here, Sabina Bitter, Judy Radul, Elspeth Pratt as well, and also SFU Vancouver, Laurie Anderson, and Scott McLean. Also wanted to thank Style Garage across the street here, who helped donate some furniture for this evening as well, Sean Callahan, and of course Andrea Creamer and Fiorella Pinillos, who work with me, did a lot of work behind the scenes leading up to the talk. It's a great honor to welcome Benjamin Bratton here. And one of the joys of working here is that I try to only program things that I'd be interested in attending myself. And so I came across Benjamin's work related to geopolitics in working on my own dissertation, and his work, of course, in eFlux and other places that's circulating in the visual arts, but found it very interesting. He's currently the Associate Professor at University of California, San Diego. He's also the Director of the Center for Design and Geopolitics. He completed his doctoral studies in the Sociology of Technology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His research deals with computational media and infrastructure, design, research management, and methodologies, classical and contemporary sociological theory, architectural and urban design problems, as well as the politics of synthetic ecologies and biologies. His current projects focus on the political geography of cloud computing, robotics, and artificial intelligence. His book, The Stack, on software and sovereignty, will be published with MIT Press in fall of 2015. I ask you to join me in welcoming Benjamin Bratton.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you to Am for the invitation to come and speak with you and share some of this work. As you got a sense from the introduction, my work is very interdisciplinary, and sometimes I'll be invited to speak to philosophy and theory audience. My work triangulates between sort of philosophy and theory, design and architecture, and digital media and software studies. And so if I'm invited to speak to the design and architecture people, I'm the philosophy and digital media guy. If it's a digital media conference, I'm the philosophy and architecture. And so I always have 1 foot in and two feet out. This book, The Stack on Software and Sovereignty, which is coming out next year from MIT Press, is my attempt to kind of put this all together into a big picture. And it's been a while since theory has been in the big picture business, unfortunately. And the questions of totalities and what we used to call meta-narratives and so forth have been held in some disrepute. And so I make no guarantees as to the repute of what we do. But what I would like to share with you tonight then is, in a way, a kind of a version of the book as a whole. And there's a way in which the sort of structure of the argument, the structure that it tries to describe in the world, tries to activate in it at once. And I think to some extent it holds together best when we see the whole picture at once. So that's kind of what I want to draw for you tonight, my picture on the cave wall here. Okay, let's begin here. In In an address to the Council on Foreign Relations on the need for a new geopolitical architecture, the then outgoing Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, made a rather striking recommendation. She said, "We need a new architecture for this new world, more Frank Gehry than formal Greek." She described the system dominated by the United Nations, NATO, and several other large organizations as the equivalent to the classical Parthenon in Athens. Quote, "By contrast, there's Gehry's modern architecture. Some of his work might appear haphazard, but in fact it's highly intentional and sophisticated," Clinton said. "Where once a few strong columns could hold up the weight of the world, today we need a dynamic mix of materials and structures." Now, looking to contemporary design for models of geopolitical architecture, both literal structures and figural systems, may be a good idea, regardless of what one may think of Gehry's rather floral morphologies as necessarily being the best option. But what drives the question remains: what drives this demand for new armatures and diagrams of global power and sovereignty? Clinton went on to point out that global information systems is perhaps the single most important, most powerful engine of this new world that would demand new organizing architectures. The continuing emergence of planetary-scale computation as infrastructure and of information as a historical category of economic and geographic substance together suggests that something fundamental has shifted off-center. But global transformations of hard and soft systems brought by computation has disturbed neat arrangements in what Clinton struggles to articulate and what we struggle to describe and design for. While trade and migration perforates borders, state sovereignty and supervision over information flows is also dramatically reinscribed and reinforced. The possible architectures at work, now and in the future, seem twisted and torqued in the extreme. But first, what happened to the old architecture? And technology and design aside, how might we see that in terms of a question for political science, let's say? My interest in the geopolitics of planetary-scale computation focuses less, this is sort of a disclaimer, focuses less on issues of personal privacy and surveillance than on how it distorts and deforms traditional Westphalian modes of political geography, which I'll describe in a moment, jurisdiction and sovereignty, and also how it, in turn, produces new territories in its own image. My interest draws sort of both from and, in many ways, against the work of Carl Schmitt and his work in the Nomos of the Earth and his, albeit savagely flawed, history of the geometries of geopolitical architecture. Now, this word nomos, N-O-M-O-S, refers to the dominant and essential logic for the political subdivisions of the earth, of land, of sea, of air, and also now of the domain that the U.S. military simply calls cyber, and for the geopolitical order that stabilizes accordingly. Now, this term loop geography in Westphalian mode, what do I mean by that exactly? The Peace of Westphalia, the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, has largely established the basic terms of the geography of the nation-state. We have the looped subdivision, maybe jagged loops, but nevertheless looped subdivision of land, inside of which everyone has a currency, a king, a flag, World Cup team, whatever. But the subdivision is of land, not of air, not of sea, not of information in this as well. And by what I mean by a loop topology, it's sort of the jagged shape, however jagged they might be. This order is dependent on this particular kind of topological diagram. One that never really held, never really sort of made it all the way, is that it was continues to be menaced by its exceptions, various enclave and exclaves that perforate and overlap this order. The diagram of the various versions of Europe, for example, by which one could be either inside or outside at any given moment. Now, today, as the nomos that was defined by the horizontal loop geometry of the modern state system creaks and groans, and as seeing like a state takes leave of that initial territorial nest, both with and against the demands of planetary scale computation, we wrestle with the irregular abstractions of information, time and territory, and the chaotic delamination of practical sovereignty from the occupation of place. And for this, a nomos of the cloud, let's say, would, for example, draw jurisdiction not only by horizontal subdivision of physical sites by and for states, but also by the vertical stacking of interdependent layers one on top of another. Two geometries, sometimes in cahoots, sometimes completely diagonal, and even unrecognizable to one another. So what then might be this new armature instead? Planetary scale computation. First, we understand that it takes different forms at different scales. Energy grids, mineral sourcing, chthonic cloud infrastructure, urban software, public service privatization, massive universal addressing systems, interfaces drawn by the augmentation of the hand, of the eye, or dissolved into objects, users both overdetermined by self-quantification and exploded by the arrival of legions of non-human users, sensors, cars, and robots. But perhaps instead of seeing all these various genres or species of contemporary computational technologies as so many different genres of machines spinning out on their own, we should, I think, see them instead as forming the body of an accidental megastructure. Perhaps these parts align, layer by layer, into something not unlike a vast, if also incomplete, pervasive, if also irregular, software and hardware stack. This model, then, is of a stack that both does and does not yet exist as such. It is a machine that serves as a schema, as much as a schema of machines. And as such, the image of totality that this conception provides would, as theories of totality have before, make the composition and design of new governmentalities and new sovereignties both more legible and more effective. So the stack, in short, is that new nomos, rendered now as a vertically thickened political geography. In my analysis, there are 6 layers of this stack, which I'll go through quickly tonight: Earth, cloud, city, address, interface, and user. And as I say, I'll touch on each of these a bit, but I want to focus specifically on the cloud and the user, and articulate to some alternative designs for these. Once you start looking for stacks, you find them everywhere. It is a model by which the entire internet as we know it already works. This is a diagram of the TCP/IP stack. And the basic principle here is that you have these vertically layered systems. Each technology within this mechanism has a specific assignment. And as long as it can send and receive information to the level above it and the level below it, you can stick any kind of machine into that layer and the whole network will continue to work. And that's how you can replace, for example, twisted pair copper wire with fiber optics and still be able to make phone calls. So when one user, let's say at the top of the application layer, is sending an email to another user, he or she sends the signal all the way down the bottom, activating the entire mechanism at once, and then all the way back up again to the other user. So the whole infrastructure, the entire apparatus is invoked twice in this sort of U-shaped structure. But as I say, once you look for them, they are kind of everywhere. And I think it's important to understand that also that when we think of these stacks and understand what they are, they're both a technical model but also an institutional model. That is, they're both a way in which of structuring machines and a way of structuring technology, but they're also a way of structuring societies, cultures, economics, and as any diagram might in fact be. And one key idea, just to hold on to, is that it's the modularity of things at any one layer that actually makes the system work the way it does. Okay, so then to the layers. Now, with these caveats in mind, it is possible, I think, to see what appears to us as already a reasonably complete image of the whole, and even perhaps to leverage this totality as a way to draw what might replace it sooner or later. Perhaps we can see all the layers at once, both as what they are and as what they do. So, starting at the bottom of the image and moving up from Earth to user, imagine this in a way as one single tracking shot. Sorry, I want to... I'm going to skip this for the purposes of time. All right, to the Earth layer. The black death of oil is formed into brilliant plastic mobile decks. Heterogeneous minerals are pulled from mountain streams, Central Africa and other places, turned into our devices. The stack terraforms the host planet by drinking and vomiting its elemental juices and spitting up mobile phones. The shiny surfaces of our handsets demand gore to gloss their faces. Satellite networks expand the literal circumference of the Earth, bearing down with false images of a denuded whole, now turned from a map into an interface, and in turn into a vast planetary epidermis, to be governed as a total living image. All this is powered by an Ouroboros-shaped smart grid, which, in distributing electrons in peer-to-peer packet networks, may rationalize and lighten the carbon burden of industrial computation, or may consume the last remaining terawatts and CO2 gigatons into a black hole of data center-shaped future ruins, in which, in doing so, spawns new jurisdictions of those affected and those causing climate change, turning the ecology itself into the final emergency against which we try to defend ourselves in a losing battle with the mathematics of biology, turning the ecology itself into a kind of final ambient emergency. Stack geographies both complicate and clarify the design of these platform sovereignties as much for what they make possible as for what they disrupt. So, Google's motto, to organize the world's information and to make it useful, changes meaning when the world itself is seen as being information, such as to organize all the information is to organize all the world. And in this, it transforms what states or other systems of governance can see, what they can know, what they can affect. It turns into a form of organizational cognition. And so, as sensing extends to all specific surfaces, no longer dumb, but now rather effective, the net sum of what is opened up or closed off by the spaces of computation largely defines what it is that any governing platform now chooses to sense and not sense in general. The extrapolation of planetary surfaces as epidermis has been inextricably linked with the conceptualization of climatic measurement and prediction. Global climate and weather systems have, of course, have long been a driving application for large-scale planetary instrumentation and the understanding of the globe itself as a vast machine. The ultimate ambition, I think, of this is to provide an open and comprehensive multi-constituent platform for monitoring and governing planetary biological and ecological systems, with particular emphasis on water distribution and carbon quantification. That is to say, this apparatus that we have built, this accidental megastructure, one accident of it, in a way, is that it is both the primary means by which we're able to identify, to measure, and to model climate change. It's also one of the primary causes of the climate change that it itself is modeling. And there was several years ago, I was on a panel with this very interesting guy who was a chip architect, a basic research guy with HP. I won't mention his name. And he was talking about a project that he was on, a panel that he was asked to join by then Vice President Gore. And the assignment of this panel was to design and to imagine the possibility of a computer that could model the entire climate in real time. What would it take to actually build a computer that could do this? And so these guys figured out that basically would take what amounts to zettabyte computing, which is several orders of magnitude beyond the kind of supercomputing that we have now or likely to have in the future. But they also figured out that such a machine able to do this would be roughly the size of Paris and would be the single most significant energy consumption event that it itself would be modeling. In a way, this is the integral accident, the snake eating its own tail problem of the Earth layer. All right. To the cloud. The platforms of the cloud layer of the stack are structured by dense, plural, and non-contiguous geographies, a hybrid of USA superjurisdiction and the charter cities, which would carve now partially privatized polities from the whole cloth of desovereigned lands. But perhaps there's a bit more there. Consider, for example, this peculiar episode from a few years ago. Some of you may remember this. Someone at Google, for reasons still sort of unknown, by accident or deliberately, moved the border between Nicaragua and Costa Rica on Google Maps. Nicaragua mobilized their military and took the new space from Costa Rica that Google had bequeathed it. A few phone calls later from the State Department, and everything was back to normal, and tensions were avoided. But if you think of what we normally take to be the basic assignments of the state, one of the key ones of these has always been cartography, just the naming and mapping of what the land is itself, on top of which civil society and all these things would operate. And here we see a kind of inversion of this, by which the cloud platform is mapping the land on top of which states might be operated and organized. And this is not, I don't think, a kind of exceptional episode. Take, for example, the more immediate and long-term geographical drama for the cloud layer, I think, which is seen more striking in the ongoing, what I call the Sino-Google conflicts of 2008 to the present. China hacking Google, Google pulling out of China, the NSA hacking China, the NSA hacking Google, Google ghostwriting books for the State Department, Google wordlessly circumventing the last instances of state sovereignty, state oversight altogether, not by transgressing them, but by absorbing them into their service offering. Meanwhile, Chinese router software bides its time. And to be sure, the geographies at work here are often quite weird. Google a few years ago filed a series of patents for offshore data centers to be built in international waters on towers using tidal currents and available water to keep the servers cool. Now, the complexities of jurisdictions suggested by a global cloud piped in from non-state space are fantastic, but today I think they are in fact less exceptional than exemplary of a new normal. So between the hackers of the People's Liberation Army and Google, there is more than, I think, a standoff between the proxies of two state apparatuses, rather a fundamental conflict over the geometry of political geography itself, one bound by the territorial integrity of the state, and the other by the gossamer threads of the world's information demanding to be, quote, organized and made useful. This is a clash between two geometries of territory, one a subdivision of the horizontal, the other a stacking of vertical layers, one a state, the other a parastate, one superimposed on top of the other at any point on the map, including us, and never resolved into some consensual cosmopolitanism, but continuing rather to grind against the grain of one another's planes. This, I think, characterizes the geopolitics of our moment, and that plus the gravity of generalized secession, but in many ways the two are interrelated. So from here, we see that contemporary cloud platforms are displacing, if not also replacing, traditional core functions of the state. And for both good and ill, demonstrating new spatial and temporal models of politics and publics. Archaic states drew their authority from the regular provision of food. And over the course of modernization, more was added to the intricate bargains of Leviathan: energy, infrastructure, legal identity and standing, objective and comprehensive maps, credible currencies, flag brand loyalties. And bit by bit, each of these and more are now provided also by cloud platforms, not necessarily as a formal replacement for the state versions, but like Google ID, simply more useful and effective for daily life. And for these platforms, the terms of participation are not mandatory, and so because of this, their social contracts are more extractive than constitutional. The Cloud Polis, these cloud polities, we could call them, draw revenue from the cognitive capital of their users, who trade attention and microeconomic compliance in exchange for global infrastructural services, and in turn, it provides each of them with an active, discrete online identity and the license to use that infrastructure. That said, it's clear, I think, that we don't have really anything like a proper geopolitical theory of these transformations. Before the full ambition of the USA security apparatus was so evident, it was, for example, thought by many that the cloud was a place where states had no ultimate competence, or maybe even a role to play. They were too slow, too dumb, too easily outwitted by using the right browser. States would be cored out, component by component, until nothing was left but a well-armed insurance scheme. In the long run, that may still be the outcome, with modern liberal states taking their place next to ceremonial monarchs, stripped of all but symbolic authority, not necessarily replaced, but displaced and misplaced to one side. But now we hear the opposite, and I think equally brittle conclusion, that the cloud is only the state, that it equals the state, that its totality, both figural and literal, is intrinsically totalitarian. Now, despite all, I wouldn't take that bet. Looking instead to the stack to come, because after all, stacks are made to be replaced by other systems. That's how they work. We observe that new forms of governance arise through the new capacities to tax flows at ports, at gates, on property, on income, on attention, on clicks, on movement, on electrons, on carbon. And it's not at all clear in the long run whether cloud platforms will overwhelm state control of such flows, or whether states will continue to evolve into cloud platforms, absorbing the displaced functions back onto themselves, or whether both will split or rotate diagonally to one another, or how deeply what we may now recognize as the surveillance state in the US or China will become a universal solvent of compulsory transparency and or cosmically opaque megastructure of absolute paranoia, or all of the above, or none of the above. So between the state, the market, and the platform, which is better designed to tax the interfaces of everyday life and to draw sovereignty thereby? It's a false choice, to be sure, but one that raises the question of where to locate the proper site of governance as such. What would it mean, what would we even mean by the public, if not that which is constituted by such interfaces? Then where should governance, meant here as the necessary, deliberate, and enforceable composition of durable political subjects and their mediations, live, if not there, in the interfaces? Not in some obtuse chain of parliamentary representation, nor in some delusional and monadic individual unit, nor in some sad little community consensus powered by moral hectoring, but instead in the imminent, immediate, and exactly present interfaces that cleave us and bind us. Where should sovereignty reside, if not in what is in between us and derived not from each of us individually, but from what draws the world through us? And for this, I think it's critical to underscore that cloud platforms, including sometimes also state apparatuses, are exactly that, platforms. And it's important as well to recognize that platforms are not only a technical architecture, but as said, they are also an institutional form. At once, they centralize like states, scaffolding the terms of participation according to rigid but universal protocols, and just as they decentralize like markets, coordinating economies not through the superimposition of fixed plans, but through interoperable and emergent interaction. So next to states, platforms are perhaps a third form, coordinating through fixed protocols while scattering free-range users watched over in loving, if also disconcertingly omniscient grace. In the platform as totality, drawing the interfaces of everyday life one into another, we observe that the maximal state and the minimal state start to look weirdly similar. And from this, our own subjective enrollment is less as citizens of a polis or as homo economicus in a market, but positioned rather as users of a platform. And as I see it, the work of geopolitical theory, of design and geopolitics, is to develop a proper history, typology, and program for such platforms. This would not, I think, be a shorthand for cloud feudalism, but models for the organization of durable alternative totalities, which would command the force of law, if not necessarily also its forms and formality. Our understanding of the political economy of platforms demands its own Hobbes and Marx and Hayek and Keynes. Okay, to cities. Tilting our heads slightly higher in our total image, we see that the urban fabric we inhabit has shifted from hunter-gatherer landscapes to sedentary fortresses back to itinerant mobilities between enclaves and exclaves, linking not just points within one city, but all cities in a discontiguous grid. The city layer of the stack comprises the environment of discontiguous megacities and mega-networks that situate both settlement and mobility in combined physical and virtual envelopes. These partition and subdivide access to urban space, but in their generic comprehensiveness, they may also provide for forms of accidental cosmopolitanism, ones not derived from parliamentary certificates, but from a shared physical relationship to ubiquitous infrastructure. This is possible only to the extent that the multiple grids of the city layer are also interfaces to other layers in the stack. The earth layer provides the incredible energy necessary to feed the physical appetites of the city layer's composite urbanism. Its epidermal imperative for seeing and sensing is not only a substrate to the city layer, it also becomes an operative logic of interfacial control and composition. The cloud layer provides the generative and reactive ambient supercomputing that makes urban envelopes and interfaces active and brings them into other formal and informal political geographic dramas. While the cloud may see urban nodes and fabrics as like any other material for computational expression, its main switches are themselves gathered into tight rings of intensive transcontinental hubs, centralizing bandwidth economies into a specific few cellular cities. Away from those bandwidth capitals, smaller cloud data centers, assembly factories, fulfillment centers, call centers, and shipping ports dot more remote geographies and gather itinerant laborers into their midst, or alternatively protect themselves against all human contact. In special cases, cloud platforms design their own architectural footprints by gathering their higher-level cognitive managerial functions into megastructural corporate headquarters, often city-scale buildings with their backs turned to their immediate location. Just above the city layer in the stack, at the address layer, provides a network presence for anything within the urban landscape and for the potential of communication between them. The territories of address instances within the larger expanse of the city are named, organized, made coherent and meaningful by the interfaces that turn maps of addressal options into practical instruments. For the user, these maps cohere the range of possible interactions and transactions, not only with the city layer, but also with the cloud and earth layers as mediated through it. Interfaces provide a channel for the user to model and monitor her own position within the range that they describe. It transforms dwellers into users of an integrated energy, carbon, cement information aggregation, adding as many points of quasi-sovereign access as they draw lines and borders and walls. And its primary architectural expression, then, is besides the discontiguous grid, is the totality of the megastructure, erecting new typologies of control and overexposure. And they also work, I wanted to make a comment that in terms of another way in which at the city layer, the importance of this as a site of governance. Another theorist who works around this notion of the nomos takes him from Giorgio Agamben, of course, who talks about the nomos of the camp, and argues that the camp, the logic of the camp, the enclosure by which the exceptional community is excluded and placed into this quasi-legal zone. The thing about the camp, and part of this question, and part of the argument that we're making is, it's in fact really in many ways the enclave that we want to observe as the real nomos there, is that from an architectural standpoint, physically, the structure of a camp is essentially indistinguishable from an enclave. What's inside and what's outside, what is inside the wall or what is outside the wall, is the sovereign decision, is a sovereign decision over which the actual governing work of that partition, that membrane, that interface actually operates. And it always goes back and forth. At any point in time, there's always a kind of reversibility of this line. And this is sort of a key point. And we were talking about this last night, and so I wanted to bring this into the conversation. The example of this reversibility I find most sort of striking is, you may remember this photograph from the early 1990s in the Yugoslavian Civil War. For the most part, the Yugoslavian Civil War is largely ignored in the global community. There was sort of people with unpronounceable names doing unspeakable things for unfathomable reasons. And then this photo was taken and was on the front page of every newspaper. There are concentration camps in Europe again. The outrage was mobilized and so forth and so on. So what do we have here? We have a group of Bosnian prisoners held in a camp behind the barbed wire, as you see here. The photographer came in, took a picture of them, and the rest of this. The Serb reaction to this was saying, no, you have this all wrong. It's not that these prisoners are inside the camp, and the photographer's looking into it. The photographer was inside the camp, and the prisoners came to the outside, and they were looking in at him. And this became the big point of contestation, many lawsuits, and all the rest of this. The point simply being is that between the camp and the enclave, that line of partition is always reversible. And the site of sovereignty, if we want to understand it as such, is one that is built into that. One of the in terms of the stack, one of the peculiar things, or one of the sort of most important things of understanding the location of this, is that the imbuing of that partition and that interface with computational intelligence, allowing it to oscillate between open and closed, between inside and outside, according to that computational intelligence, allows the sovereignty of decision to be a function of the program, to be a function of the software that is organizing and governing that particular gateway, that particular aperture, that particular orifice. And so the control of the program is in many ways the site by which that sovereignty of the decision over the partition is made real. We'll talk a bit more about interface in a moment. I want to then move to the address layer. The address layer is essential to the way in which the stack works, because it makes possible, it names and enumerates anything that it is possible to participate in and be enrolled in this drama. Something must have a name, it must have a number for it to have presence, and for it to be able to communicate, it must have this presence, whatever it is, of thing, large, small, immaterial, or so forth. In terms of the internet, in the most conventional sense, And this, first, the granularity of this, of what it is that can possibly operate, can be extraordinary. In terms of the internet, in the most prosaic sense, part of the problem of the address layer is we've actually run out of addresses. You know that in the IPv4 addresses, they've all been allocated. There's only about 3.5 billion possible addresses within the address space of IPv4. Like there's and so forth. And 7 billion people in the world, it's less than one address per person. So for a real ubiquitous computing type of scenario, a different addressing mechanism is absolutely necessary to have a geography that's granular enough to actually incorporate all the things that need to be incorporated into this communicative matrix. So one of the solutions that's been worked on is IP version 6. IP version 6 is a 128-bit address string, as opposed to the 16-bit for IP version 4. 128-bit addressing. The theoretical. So when would this run out? Well, the theoretical address space of 128-bit address space divided by, say, 7 billion people works out to something like 10 to the 23 addresses per person. Not in total, but per person. Now, if you were to try to allocate 10 to the 23 addresses over the course of your life, you're going to give an internet address to every single thing you ever came in contact with over the course of your life. You would never run out of them, right? It's not just like every piece of paper that you come in contact with, or every letter on every piece of paper. It's more like the molecules and the ink on the piece of paper that you might come in contact with. Why you would assign internet addresses to each of the molecule and the ink and the paper so they could talk to each other is a different question. But the idea of having the ability of things at completely different scales, something that exists at, say, 10 to the 9 meters and something 10 to the negative 9 meters, actually being able to exchange real Shannon information with each other is fantastic. What the bee pollen wants to say to the forest directly, we don't know. But another way to think of this is that, on the other hand, is that we can also assign addresses to things that don't have mass. You could assign an address to the relations between things, right? You can assign an address to the microphone. We can also assign an address to the fact that I'm sitting next to the microphone for this particular period of time. That relation between two things can itself can have an address. And then if we wanted to also address, where the manufacture of the microphone, where the petroleum that went into the plastic of the microphone ultimately came from, individual circuitry, of those relations of relations of relations of relations of relations, all the way down into the turtles, all the way down into the abyss. In principle, you could exhaust 10 to the 23 addresses instantaneously, depending on how far of relations you wish to go. So, in other words, somewhere between never and instantaneously is the design space of what I call deep address as well. Now, it's important also to think about this in a more practical sense. The idea that everything would have, in any, really at the level of at a molecular level, can have an internet address and be part of this communicative matrix, certainly brings to mind any number of kinds of dystopian scenarios of absolute transparency and absolute observation. But at the same time, I think it's important also to understand how this kind of addressing and the assignment of an address between two things and two things that are kind of scales also in many ways I think will prove to be an extremely important kind of compositional medium, and a medium for the composition of the traces, positions, and interrelations between things at different kinds of natural scales and temporalities that draws otherwise illegible forms not into what I call the internet of Hesietes, more than an internet of things, that making from the nano and macro scale all the way up to the other, forming these kind of irregular, alien, and discontiguous meshes out of network matter and substantialized abstractions toward absolute communication and absolute incommunication at once, as multiple maps and geographies name and number intersecting territories, enrolling them into different assemblages. In other words, you can have multiple totalities at the same time. Just as we see with the Google and China situation, where we have Google, in essence, I'm using them a bit metonymically, Google making a total claim over this space, China making a total claim over this space, these two totalities superimposed upon one another, grinding against each other. The same is true for the universal addressing regimes. In other words, everything in the room can be addressed by one regime, and it can be addressed by another regime once over. These two regimes don't necessarily have to have anything, even know anything about each other, have any kind of formal compatibility. In other words, in many ways, the best defense against the pathologies of a too strict totality is the introduction of another totality. All right, totalities against totalities. I want then to turn to the interface, which is the point in the software stack where people and things touch the cloud. It's there in and as the interface that we draw the cloud as a world picture, as a cosmogram. It's there that the political theology of the cloud expresses and codifies utopias. There that the affective intensity of iconic, and symbolic, and indexical science not only synthesize technical affordances, signification, but also narrativize the meaning of possible actions that users might take, significance. So from the interface looking down, 4 of the 6 layers of the stack are now seen at once. And above them, we observe interfaces, particularly graphical user interfaces, which is the sort of the dominant mode of the interface of our time, make the far-flung Earth, cloud, city, and address layers legible for users of the stack who couldn't possibly map the cause and effect relations or of even their own actions as we take through it. So as you initiate what I call a column in this U shape up and down the stack, you can't possibly anticipate or even understand in advance all of the forms of things that you're triggering through supply chains, through the vast logistical networks, through so forth and so on. Interfaces are part of the way in which we try to make sense of the systems that into which we locate ourselves. As they multiply, interfaces assemble into interfacial regimes, which present and enforce systemic diagrammatic total images of how the platform can work for a user who perceives that platform through the grammar of that same regime, and whose actions are sensed and read by it in turn. That is, the interface is not only how the user sees the stack, it's also the filter through which the stack sees the user. And as we were discussing last night, it's interesting I think it's very important to understand the history of the interface within this particular trajectory and genealogy of the diagram. Now, I define the interface much more broadly. An interface is any point of contact between two complex systems which governs the condition of exchange between those systems. So a button with words on it that you click is an interface, a closed door is an interface, an international border is an interface. But the predominant mode of the interface for our time and with the rest of the stack is the graphical user interface, which is a special kind of diagram. This is Menard's famous diagram of Napoleon's ill-fated march to Russia, as many of you know. Model 7 different things at once, but in the most obvious one is that the orange wedge atop indicates the number of soldiers who left Paris, who made it to Moscow. The black line represents the number who made it back from Moscow. So the diagram is a way in which this extraordinary complex series of events is summarized, is reduced. The amount of information, for it to resonate, for it to be legible, it has to reduce the amount of information that it represents dramatically. Not beyond 99% of the information has to be reduced into something that's there. That's how it works and how it becomes legible as a mechanism, and how it uses these forms of linear juxtaposition, so forth and so on, to actually work this out. But the chain and that's what Peirce dealt with diagrams as one of the key operations of semiotics and one of the main differentiations between Peirce and sociotheory and semiotics. But for diagrams, you have a one-way chain of representation. There's an events that happen in the world, and then they bubble up and are reduced, encoded, if you like, encrypted into a diagrammatic image. But the causal relationship is essentially one way. The representational chain is one way. The way in which graphical user interfaces work as a mode of the diagram is to double that chain of representation. They're diagrams that not only represent complex and synthesize as complex systemic events. When you manipulate that diagram, when you move the lever, where you click the button, it causes that chain of representation goes essentially back through the network to affect the thing that is being represented. So it's both an image that is a tool and a tool that is an image, a visual equipment that has become visual, and a representation that has in fact become technological in this regard, which, as we know, in many ways causes as many problems as it solves. And to that, we can see that, continuing this genealogical line, we see that earlier hand-based tools may have passed for a moment into iconic point and click. That within the original tools we worked with were held in our hands, and then for a moment they became pictures of things that when you click on them, something like that thing might happen. Right? I click on the printer and printing happens in the world. But now, in a way, they return to a more sort of form of embodied gesture and perception, including, in many ways, the app sub-platforms that introduce new interfacial capacities into generic hardware. But for this naturalistic synthesis of cognition and interfaciality, for some interfacial forms, so for example, the generic, what we call generically augmented reality, the metaphorical space between the icon and what is represented, or between the interface and the platform it interfaces, begins to implode. Subsequently, some platform totalities are then drawn into what we can only call a kind of theologic projection, for which the work of anamnesis is externalized into these perceptual and instrumental events, which provide both signification and the significance of objects and events, as well as the terms of encounter that the user should have with them. So the most imminent and obvious accident of augmented reality is, I suppose, a kind of deeply granular, pervasive advertising by which our embodied perceptions and gestures generate the monetizable exchange value of the network user profile. AR is where micro-targeting business models of cognitive capitalism melt into the choreography of the mobile user subject. The work that user subject already does to perfect the testing algorithms for search engines is thus scaled from finger points and clicks to the very musculature and dance of dwelling itself. However, I fear that ultimately a less secular danger is latent in AR, and that its most killer app is not marketing but fundamentalist religion. AR promises the design of a differential sacrality whereby the Schmittian, Manichaean, political theological segmentation of the whole world into friend and enemy becomes a direct literal annotation of the life world, a subtitling of clean and unclean, ours and theirs, sacred and profane, empire and rebel forces, orc and not orc, red team, blue team. And so we fear then a kind of militarization of cognition itself, as atavistic fundamentalisms move from the direct augmentation of reality, once nevertheless requiring a kind of textual interpretation, but now to new political theologies now emerge alongside them. And this, again, we have layers of totalities on top of totalities. But here, the elemental terms of the superimposition is the Catechism of War. So you see, for any kind of theological model, which oftentimes is a sort of differentiation of of the food or the people or the land, a segmentation of possession, of cleanliness, there's fortunately been a a level of necessary textual interpretation on the part of everyone to understand what it is that one is supposed to do, eat or not eat. We don't go around smashing the Amalekites all the time. But when those prescriptions and those descriptions are literally superimposed onto what one sees, I think that the temptation for forms of fundamentalist cognition the gravity of that temptation will be irresistible. Not just for the Abrahamic monotheisms that we have, but for new forms that will emerge. Okay. Lastly, then, this is us. One of the useful paradoxes of the user's position as a political subject is the contradictory impulse directed simultaneously towards his artificial over-individualization and his ultimate pluralization, with both participating differently in the geopolitics of transparency. For example, the quantified self movement, which in California, where I'm from, really is a true kind of medical theology, is haunted by this contradiction. And how so? At first, the intensity and granularity of the new informational mirror image convinces the user of his individuated coherency and stability as a subject. He's flattered by the singular beauty of his reflection. And this is why quantified self is so popular with those inspired by an X-Men reading of Atlas Shrugged. But as more data is added to the diagram that quantifies his interactions with the outside world, and to the outside's quote-unquote impact on his person, the health of his microbial biome in his gut, the immediate and long-term environmental conditions, his various epidemiological contexts, and so on, the quality of everything that is not him comes to overcode and overwhelm any notion of himself as a withdrawn and self-contained agent. Like Theseus Paradox, where after every component of a thing has been replaced and nothing original remains but a metaphysical husk. You've probably heard this in terms of, like George Washington's axe. This is the original axe with which he cut down the cherry tree. We had to replace the handle 3 times and the head 4 times, but it occupies the same space. Right? This is the Theseus Paradox. And like this, the user is confronted in a way with a kind of existential lesson that at any point he is only the intersection of many streams. So at first, the subject position of the user overproduces individual identity, but in the continuance of that same mechanism, it then succeeds in exploding it. So, too much identity, crash of identity. The geopolitics of the user we have now is inadequate, including, I think, many of its oppositional modes. The Oedipal discourse of privacy and transparency in relation to the evil eye of the uninvited stepfather is probably, in its own sort of way, a kind of necessary phase towards real alternatives, but it has tremendously fragile limits worth spelling out. And by this I mean WikiLeaks, Assange, Tor, this sort of thing. A geopolitics of computation predicated at its core on the biopolitics of privacy, of self-immunization from any compulsory appearance in front of publics, of platforms, of states, of others, can sometimes also serve a psychological internalization of a now ascendant general economy of secession, castration, anxiety, whatever, resulting in the pre-paranoia of withdrawal into an atomic and anomic dream of self-mastery that elsewhere we call the neoliberal subject. The space in which the discursive formation of the subject meets the technical constitution of the user enjoys, however, a much larger horizon than the one defined by these kinds of individuation. Consider, for example, proxy users. uProxy is a project supported by Google Ideas. A friend of mine is a programmer there on this project. uProxy is a browser modification that lets users easily pair up across distances to allow someone in one location, trapped in the bad internets, to send information unencumbered through the virtual position of another user in another location, enjoying the good internets. In other words, two users can essentially combine into a single position as far as the internet is concerned. It's one. So for, again, this is Google Ideas, Jared Cohen's group, and one can imagine the special interest of baking this into Chrome at scale. For Sino-Google Geopolitics, the platform could theoretically be available at billion user scale to those who live in China, even if Google is not technically in China, because those users, acting through and as foreign proxies, are themselves, as far as the internet geography is concerned, both in and not in China. Developers of uProxy believe that it would take two simultaneous and synchronized man-in-the-middle attacks to hack the link, and at population scale that would prove difficult even for the best state actors, at least for now. More disconcerting, perhaps, is that such a framework could also just as easily be used to withdraw data from a paired site. That is, one you might be paired with in ways in which you're not necessarily volunteering for. A paired user may be one that should be left alone for good reasons. Some plural user subject that is conjoined by a proxy link or other means could be composed, however, of many different types of addressable subjects. Two humans in different countries, or a human and a sensor and a bot, a human and a robot, and a sensor, a whatever and a whatever. In principle, any one of these subcomponents could not only be part of multiple conjoined positions, but might not know or need to know, always to know which meta user, let's say, they contribute to, any more than the microbial biome in your gut needs to know your name. Spoofing with honeypot identities between humans and non-humans then is measured according to the theoretical address space of deep address that we spoke of, the 10 to the 23 per person, or some other massive universal addressing scheme, such that the abyssal quantity and range of, quote, things that could participate in these vast pluralities includes both real and fictional addressable persons, objects, locations, even addressable massless relations between things, any one of which could be a sub-user. And so while the stack and the stack to come, which we call the black stack for lack of a better name, stages the death of the user, in one sense, the eclipse of a certain resolute humanism, but does so because they also bring the multiplication and proliferation of other kinds of non-human users, including sensors, financial algorithms, various robots from nanometric to landscape scale, any combination of which might enter into a relationship as part of a composite user. And so this is also where, for example, the recent shift by major cloud platforms into robotics may prove especially vital because, like Darwin's tortoises finding their way to different Galapagos islands, the Cambrian explosion in robotics coming near you soon, sees speciation occur in the wild, not just in the lab, and with us as their inside, not just on the outside. And so as robotics and cloud hardware at all scales blend into a kind of common category of machine, such that that a robot that's built is not just programmed once and set out there, but is able to, when it encounters something unusual in its environment, is able to access options in the cloud, becomes informed by it. They begin to literally evolve into the wild. As it does so, it will become it'll be unclear in general everyday human-robotic interaction whether one is encountering a fully autonomous, partially autonomous, or completely human-piloted synthetic intelligence. Everyday interactions replay the Turing test over and over. Is this a person or a machine? Is there a person behind this machine? And if so, how much is a person? In time, the answer may come to matter less, as the postulation of the human or even carbon-based life as the threshold measure of intelligence and as the qualifying gauge of a political ethics may seem like tasteless vestigial racism, replaced by less anthropocentric frames of reference. The position of the user then maps only very incompletely onto any one individual person or body. From the perspective of the platform looking out, what looks like one may really be many, and what looks like many may only be one. And so, elaborate schizophrenias already take hold in our early negotiation of these composite user positions. The neoliberal subject position makes absurd demands on people as users, as quantified selves, as sysadmins of their own psyche. And from this, paranoia and narcissism are two symptoms of the same disposition, two functions of the same mask. For one, the mask works to pluralize identity, according to the subjective demands of the user position as a composite alloy. And for another, it defends against those same demands on behalf of the illusory integrity of a self-identity fracturing around its existential core. So ask yourself, is that user anonymous because he's dissolved into the vital machinic plurality, or because public identification threatens individual self-mastery, sense of autonomy, social unaccountability? The former and the latter are two very different politics, but use the same masks and use the same software suites. Given the schizophrenic economy of the user, first over-individuated and then multiplied and de-differentiated, this really isn't an unexpected or necessarily neurotic reaction at all. It is, however, fragile and inadequate. So, in the construction of the user as an aggregate profile that both is and is not specific to any one identity, to any one entity, there is no identity to deduce other than the pattern of interaction between partial actors. We may find, perhaps ironically, that the user position of the stack actually has far less in common with the neoliberal form of the subject than some of today's oppositionalist formats for political subjectivity that hope, quite rightly, to challenge and reform and resist the state stack as it is currently configuring itself. However, something like, for example, a digital bill of rights for users, of Tim Berners-Lee's proposal, one of the founding fathers of the WWW protocol, despite its cosmopolitan optimism, becomes a much more complicated and fragile and limited solution when the discrete identification of a user is both so heterogeneous and so fluid. Are all proxy composite users one user? Is anything with an IP address a user? If not, why not? Is this throne reserved for one species, humans? When is any one animal of that species a user? When is it not? Any time that is generating information, is it then a user? If so, that policy would, in practice, crisscross and trespass some of our most basic concepts of the political, and perhaps for that reason alone might be a good place to start. In addition to the fortification of the user as a geopolitical subject, we also require then a redefinition of the political subject as such in relation to the real operations of the user, not based not on homo economicus or on parliamentary liberalism, nor on post-structuralist linguistic reduction, nor on the will to secede into the moral safety of individual privacy and withdrawn from coercion. Instead, the definition should focus on composing and elevating sites of governance from the immediate suturing interfacial material between subjects in the stitches and traces and the folds of interactions between bodies and things at a distance, congealing into different networks, demanding very different kinds of platform sovereignty. So, I want to then turn, in anticipation of conclusion, toward not the stack we have, but the stack we might have, the stack to come. Hopefully by now we have some map of this, some way to visualize the stack and how it organizes generic columns up and down. Without too much trouble, we can model a kind of baseline scenario for the individual human user, citizen, subject named and profiled, using some vanilla platform interface connected to a stable mix of IPv4 and 6 address websites, smart objects, situated in a specific city, connected to a public-private Wi-Fi jurisdictions governed by application architectures of the global cloud platforms such as Google and the Earth layer, drawing itself local hydroelectric energy as well as the coal plants that power the servers accessed by its users. That we could say is a kind of our generic column. But we can also imagine another stack in which the user is, for example, an environmental sensor. The interface is a data reporting. Here's our generic column. Interface is a data reporting API. Addresses are assigned to individual threshold events as detected, all working in a city layer of a threatened rainforest as part of a transnational carbon risk reinsurance cloud platform and pulling low wattage power from plentiful solar and chemical energy sources. We can also draw another possible stack in which an assemblage of 2 robots, 3 delimited algorithms activating from afar, and 3 humans on 3 different continents constitute the composite user, linking them at the interface layer through a Shanghainese fork of Android that translates between 5 or 6 different languages at work. We can imagine them mapping and acting upon a specific culinary agricultural assemblage that has been addressed according to the Bronze Age dietary conventions, located in multiple, even hostile city-states, accessing a mix of several public cloud applications as well as encrypted proprietary databases, sucking up and all of the above stew utility electrons. Or an unnamed kid at a quasi-public 3D printing works in Lagos using 2 different open-source additive manufacturing APIs, downloaded CAD scripts and YouTube uploader for Windows to spoof the address of printed bicycle cranks that will now phone home and report that they are actually licensed and operational in Cape Town, but which are really being used to haul bags of cement to the 4th floor of a building that shows up as having only 2 floors on Google Earth real-time, at least when queried from South African IPs, all running on the Afrinic version of Google's no-carrier-free continent cloud, sucking energy from a Franco-Chinese nuclear plant on the shores of Lake Chad and chewing up circuitry minerals recycled from e-waste drone lifts from Bosongoa and Central African Republic, courtesy of the All-African Defense Forces, and so on. It's not hard to come up with the political science fiction scenarios, but it is hard to specify the shape of them as working in combination, if only because any of the layers in any of these scenarios, what exists in any one of these layers, any scenarios, could just as easily be combined with layers in any of the others. Take 2 to 5 layers from one, stir and simmer. So instead of neatly homogeneous utopias or dystopias, it's the divergent mixtures that resist designation as they generate and draw upon the energy loss and radiant waste materials of whatever is most distant or closest at hand that may nevertheless be the most crucial. All of which is to say is that the project of this stack is not just one of description, it's also one of projection. It's a positing this is a design problem. What stacks do, the one that has sections of the architecture, their advantage is that anything can be pulled out of one layer and anything else can be added. They're inviting replacement. There's a fair bit of competition for the colonization of the stack as such. Just a few weeks ago, I was sending a bunch of emails in my inbox because this is like 3 weeks ago, a bunch of emails in my inbox. Der Spiegel in Berlin had published a bunch of new of the Snowden leaks, including a bunch of complete, usually there's just crazy PowerPoints. There's a whole reading to be done of just the psychotic PowerPoint semiotics of the NSA. But this slide in particular caught my attention. This is the map that comes from a project, an NSA project called Treasure Map, and it's based on what was unaware to me was an NSA, the way in which they map their domain, which has a geographical layer, a physical network layer, a logical network layer, which could roughly be like the address layer, and something called the cyber persona layer, which is different than the persona layer. So I did a bit of research on this, and this map is actually not secret. It had been around for a while, though hidden, but not particularly public. All of which is to say is that the model is one that there's a fair bit of momentum over who will determine what replaces what and at what time, and in many ways, the mobilization towards alternatives is probably can be understood as the most pressing design problem, political problem, assignment of our time. I'll conclude then with some thoughts then on both the stack we have and this idea of the black stack. There's been black stack. Some of this text is taken from this piece called Black Stack we published in eFlux a while ago, which was the keynote lecture I had given at Transmediala last year in Berlin. The title simply comes from I was doing the joint keynote with Metahaven, who are good friends of mine and who are working with me on this book in some ways. They have a book coming out called Black Transparency. I have a book coming out, The Stack, which said we'll call it the Black Stack, will be the talk. But nevertheless, it stuck as this name for a kind of, the stand-in name for the stack to come. The one that we can't quite see, the one we know is there, but is we don't know quite what it is. The stack we have is defined not only then by its forms, its layers and platforms and their interrelations, but then also by its content, and is now painfully clear, leak after leak, that content is also the content of our daily communications, now weaponized against us. However, so if the Panopticon Effect, Foucault's famous Panopticon Effect, is when you don't know whether you're being watched or not, and so you behave as if you are, then we could say that the inverse Panopticon Effect is when you know you're being watched, but act as if you aren't. This is today's surveillance culture, exhibitionism in bad faith. And the emergence of stack platforms doesn't promise any solution or even any distinctions between friend and enemy within this optical geopolitics. At some dark day in the future, when considered against the Google caliphate, the NSA may even come to be seen as the public option. At least it is accountable in principle to some parliamentary limits, they will say, rather than merely stockholder avarice and flimsy user agreements. So if we take 9/11, for example, as the role and the rollout of the Patriot Act as the year zero for the USA's massive data gathering, encapsulation, and digestion campaign, one that we're only really now beginning to comprehend, even as parallel projects from Russia and China, Europe, Canada maybe, I don't know, are sure to come to light in time, then we can imagine the entirety of network communication for the last decade, the big haul, as a single, deep and wide digital simulation of the world, or at least a significant portion of it. It's an archive, a library of the real. Its existence as the purloined property of the state, just as a physical fact, is almost occult. Almost. The geophilosophical profile of the big haul, from the energy necessary to preserve it to its governing instrumentality, understood as both a text, a very large text, and as a machine with various utilities, overflows the traditional politics of software. Its story is much more Borges than Lawrence Lessig. Its fate is as well. Can it be destroyed? Is it possible to delete this simulation, and is it even desirable to do so? Is there a trash can big enough for the big delete? Even if the plug could be pulled on all future data halls, stopping it all immediately, surely there must be a backup somewhere, the identical double of the simulation, such that if we delete one, the other will be forever haunting history until it's rediscovered by some future artificial intelligent archaeologist interested in its own Paleolithic origins? Would we bury it, even if we could? Would we need signs around it, like those designed for the Yucca Mountain nuclear waste disposal site, warning off unknowable future excavations? Those of us lucky enough to be alive during this 15-year span would enjoy a certain illegible immortality, curious to whatever metacognitive entity pieces us back together by our online activities, both public and private, proud and furtive, each of us rising back centuries from now, each of us a little Ozymandias of cat videos and Pornhub. In light of this, the black stack could come to mean very different things. On the one hand, it would imply that this simulation is opaque and unmappable, not disappeared, but that the whole thing is ultimately redacted. It could imply that from the ruined fragments of this history, another coherent totality can be carved against the grain, even from the deep recompetency at and below the earth layer of the stack. Its blackness is the surface of a world that can no longer be composed by addition because it's so absolutely full, overwritten and overdetermined, and to add more is just so much ink into the ocean. Instead of tabula rasa, this tabula plenus allows for creativity and figuration only by subtraction, like scratching paint from the canvas, by carving away, by death, by replacement. The structural logic of the stack system, as I said, allows for the replacement of whatever occupies one layer with something else, and for the rest of the architecture to continue to function without pause. For example, the content of any one layer, earth, cloud, city address interface, or user could be replaced, including the masochistic, hysterical fiction of the individual user, both neoliberal and neo-other things, while the rest of the layers remain a viable armature for global infrastructure. The stack is designed to be remade. That is its technical form. But unlike replacing copper wire with fiber optics in the transmission layer of TCP/IP, replacing one kind of user with another is more difficult. Today we're doing it by adding more and different kinds of things into the user position. We should, however, allow also for more comprehensive displacements, not just by elevating things to the status of political subjects or technical agents, but by making way for genuinely post-human and ahuman positions. For some dramas, but hopefully not for the fabrication for the stack to come, black or otherwise, a certain humanism and companion figure of humanity still presumes its traditional place at the center of the frame. We must let go of the demand that any artificial intelligence arriving at sentience or sapience must care deeply about humanity, us specifically, as the subject and object of its knowing and its desire. The real nightmare, worse than the one in which the big machine wants to kill you, is the one in which it sees you as irrelevant, not even as a discrete thing to know. Worse than being seen as the enemy is not being seen at all. Or as Eliezer Yudkowsky puts it, the AI does not hate you, nor does it love you, but you are made out of atoms which it can use for something else. One of the integral accidents of the stack may then be this anthrocidal trauma that shifts us from a design career as the authors of the Anthropocene to the role of supporting actors in the arrival of the post-Anthropocene. The black stack may also be black because we cannot see our own reflection in it. In the last instance, its geopolitics is then less eschatological than chemical, because its grounding in time is based less on the promise of historical dialectics than on the rot of isotope decay. It's drawn, I believe, by the inhuman and inhumanist molecular form finding. Pre-Cambrian flora changed into peat oil, changed into children's toys, dinosaurs changed into birds, changed into ceremonial headdresses, computation itself converted into whatever meta machine comes next. Stack into black stack. Thank you.